It was a beautiful afternoon, one of those perfect spring days when the sun felt warm, but the breeze kept it comfortable. The sky was a crisp blue, and the sound of birds singing from the trees made it seem like the world had come to a quiet, peaceful pause. The neighborhood was calm, no sirens, no chaos, just the usual hum of suburban life. People were tending to their lawns, children were playing, and the air had a certain sweetness that only spring could bring. But for us, that perfect afternoon would soon be forever stained by an unthinkable act. My son, Liam, had been in his wheelchair for as long as I could remember. Born with cerebral palsy, his body had never been able to keep up with his dreams. He had a brilliant mind and a heart full of hope, but his muscles often failed him. Yet, despite the challenges, Liam was always full of joy. He loved to be outside. The simplest things brought him happiness. A gentle breeze on his face, the feeling of the grass beneath his wheels, the excitement of the world moving just a little faster as he zoomed down the sidewalk. He never let his disability stop him from enjoying the beauty of the world around him. On this particular day, Liam had rolled his wheelchair to the edge of our front lawn, just like he did many times before. He wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just playing a game of catch by himself. He tossed the ball a short distance and tried to catch it as it rolled back toward him. It wasn't a complex game, just something to pass the time, but to him, it was everything. The look on his face as he concentrated on the ball, smiling every time he managed to catch it, was pure joy. It was the kind of moment any parent would cherish, the simple moments of peace and happiness. But as I watched Liam from the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't know why, but a part of me sensed that today would not end like any other ordinary afternoon. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to my own overprotectiveness. After all, we had lived in this neighborhood for years, and while there were occasional tensions between neighbors, nothing ever seemed like it would escalate to anything dangerous. We lived in a safe, suburban bubble, or at least that's what I had thought. I could see Karen, the HOA board member, standing at the window of her house across the street. She had been watching us for a while. I didn't know how long exactly, but I could feel her gaze. I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes would narrow every time Liam ventured near her property line. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that would seem alarming at first glance, but something about her posture, her way of standing there, made me uncomfortable. I knew she had always been a little too obsessed with the rules of the neighborhood, constantly checking whether people followed the HOA guidelines. But I never imagined that would lead to something as extreme as what was about to happen. Liam, oblivious to the tense energy radiating from across the street, was completely engrossed in his game. The world seemed to fade away for him, and in that moment he was no longer bound by the limitations of his wheelchair. He was just a boy playing in the yard, caught up in the simple thrill of the game, as any child should be. But Karen was watching, and for reasons that still haunt me, that wasn't enough for her. I should have gone outside and checked on Liam, but I was busy with something inside the house. That moment of hesitation, that split second of thinking everything was fine, turned out to be the worst mistake of my life. I heard her footsteps before I saw her, Karen's heavy, purposeful steps approaching the yard. She was moving quickly, far quicker than I had ever seen her move before. There was no time to stop her. Before I could even react, she was at the edge of the lawn. "Liam," she shouted, her voice sharp and full of authority. The tone was one I had heard many times before, always cold and demanding. "Get off my property." Her words cut through the air like a whip, harsh and cruel, but they were far more than a simple command. They were an ultimatum, a warning, and in her eyes, they were justified. Liam looked up at her, confused by the outburst. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He didn't understand why she was angry. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had every right to be outside, just like anyone else. But Karen wasn't interested in fairness or reason. Her eyes were filled with an icy determination, and I knew instantly that this wasn't just about the lawn. It was something deeper, something much darker. "Karen, please, I called from inside the house, my voice rising with concern. He's just playing, he's not bothering anyone. But my voice went unheard. Karen was already walking toward Liam. Her eyes locked on him with an intensity one hadn't seen before. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate. The hatred that radiated from her was palpable, and it was all directed at my son. Her words were no longer the most dangerous thing she had in her hands. What happened next still makes no sense to me. Before I could move or shout again, I heard a loud, deafening noise, a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet street. It was the sound of a gunshot. I froze. I didn't understand. Was it fireworks? No, it was too loud, too close. I ran outside, my heart pounding in my chest, but I wasn't fast enough. By the time I reached the front yard, I saw it, the horror, the nightmare I had never, in 1,000 lifetimes, thought I would experience. Liam was on the ground, clutching his leg, his body convulsing in pain. Blood was everywhere. His face, once bright with the innocence of a child, was now contorted in terror. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even cry out. All he could do was gasp for air, his breaths shallow and ragged. And there she stood, Karen, holding a gun, pointed at the ground, her eyes cold and detached. It wasn't just anger on her face, it was something far darker. She looked at Liam like he was nothing more than an obstacle, something to be dealt with, something beneath her. The world around me spun, out of control. My son, my beautiful, innocent child, was lying on the grass, bleeding, and Karen was standing there, watching him. And that was when it hit me. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was intentional. This was the result of years of pent-up anger, bitterness, and a complete disregard for human life. Everything that had been so perfect moments ago was gone. My son's laughter, the gentle breeze, the warmth of the sun, it all felt like a distant memory. All that remained was the raw, painful reality of what had just unfolded. The unthinkable had just become our reality, and nothing in this world could have prepared me for the horror that was now unfolding in front of me. The shock was paralyzing. My mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened, and my body reacted before I could think. I rushed toward Liam, my heart racing, my hands trembling as I tried to assess the damage. The sight of his leg, blood oozing from a wound so deep and severe, felt like it had paralyzed me too. I barely registered Karen's movement, her eyes still locked on my son, her hand still gripping the gun as if it were some kind of sick trophy. Why? I shouted, my voice hoarse with a mix of anger and disbelief. Why would you do this to him? He's just a child. A child. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she looked down at Liam, who was now moaning in pain, his hands gripping the side of his wheelchair as if trying to hold himself together in the face of this unimaginable violence. The scene around us felt distorted, like I was in a nightmare, watching but unable to wake up. The blood staining the grass, the horrified faces of neighbors peering from behind their windows, none of it felt real. I told him to stay off my lawn, Karen said, her voice cold and calculated, as if she were explaining the most trivial of matters. He didn't listen. He had to be taught a lesson. She spoke with such casual detachment that it sent a chill down my spine. The audacity, the cruelty in her words hit me like a slap to the face. This was no longer just a simple dispute about property lines. No, this was a cold, calculated attack fueled by a hatred that ran deeper than anything I had imagined. Karen's obsession with control, her inability to see Liam as a person, just a boy who deserved the same dignity and respect as anyone else, had reached a deadly crescendo. My hands, still shaking from the initial shock, found their way to Liam's wound. I tried to stop the bleeding, to comfort him, but my mind was spiraling. How could this happen? How could a grown woman, a neighbor, a person I had passed countless times without a second thought, do this to my son? But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed almost indifferent to the pain she had caused. Her next words made it clear that this wasn't about teaching Liam a lesson, it was about something far darker. I warned him before, she continued, her voice devoid of any emotion. I told him to stay away from my yard, and yet he kept coming. People like him think they can do whatever they want without consequences. Liam's chest heaved with every shallow breath he took. The pain in his face was unbearable. My mind raced to find something, anything to stop the blood from flowing, to help him, to get him the help he desperately needed. But my thoughts were interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. It wasn't enough. It wasn't fast enough. I looked up at Karen, my gaze hardening. "You are going to regret this," I said through clenched teeth, though I barely recognized the voice that came from me. Anger, fear, and desperation mingled together, threatening to break me. She smirked, a small, twisted curl of her lips, as if what she had done was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a necessary step in her twisted sense of justice. "I don't think so," she replied calmly. "I've done what needed to be done." It was then that I saw it, the gun in her hand. She wasn't holding it out of fear or self-defense. No, she was holding it like a weapon of control, as though the power it gave her was her only claim to authority in this world. The stark reality of the situation hit me all at once. This wasn't just an act of anger. It was premeditated. It was deliberate. It was a display of dominance. And Liam, my sweet, innocent Liam, had been the target of that sick display. By now, the sirens were growing louder, but they felt far away, like they belonged to someone else's world. The world we were in, my world, Liam's world, was now irrevocably changed. The sounds of distant voices began to fill the air, neighbors murmuring, police officers arriving, and all I could do was hold my son's hand and pray that help was on the way. I couldn't take my eyes off Karen. Every fiber of my being screamed to do something, anything to stop her, to make her see the damage she had caused, but all I could do was watch as she stood there with her gun, her indifference to the suffering she had caused almost more terrifying than the act itself. Somewhere in the chaos, the police had arrived, but even they seemed hesitant. I didn't blame them, not entirely. Karen was well known in the neighborhood, a self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA's rules, and with her perfect record and polished facade, she carried an air of authority. But that authority, I quickly realized, was as hollow as the lies she had fed everyone in the community. She wasn't a protector of the neighborhood. She was a threat, a predator disguised as a pillar of the community. As the officers approached her, I could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't know what to do. They were trained to handle situations, but nothing in their training could have prepared them for this. A woman, standing so confidently in front of them, holding a gun that had just been used on a defenseless child, seemed like a force they weren't ready to reckon with. She knew it too, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about power anymore. This was about my son, about the pain in his eyes, and the suffering that no child should ever have to endure. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I finally turned away from Karen, looking at Liam one last time before the officers moved in to apprehend her. His eyes were glazed with pain, his small body trembling with shock, and all I could do was hold him tighter, whispering comforting words into his ear, trying desperately to ease the terror that had taken over his once carefree world. The world seemed to collapse in on me. The chaos of the moment blurred everything around me, the flashing red lights of police cars, the distant murmurs of onlookers, the sharp scent of blood in the air. But all I could focus on was Liam, my son, lying on the ground in front of me, his face pale and contorted with pain, his small hands clutching at his leg as if trying to stop the blood from flowing. His screams were a twisted melody that played over and over in my mind, each one more guttural than the last. I dropped to my knees beside him, my heart racing in my chest, every inch of my body screaming in panic. "Liam," I whispered, trying to steady myself as I took his hand in mine. "Liam, I'm here. I'm right here, baby. Just hold on, okay? Just hold on." But he couldn't hear me. His eyes were wide with terror, his breath shallow as he gasped for air. His leg, once so full of life as he moved in his wheelchair, now lay motionless, stained with blood. The pain had consumed him entirely, and I felt so helpless. Every second felt like an eternity. I had to do something, I had to stop the bleeding, but my mind was fogged with the panic of not knowing how to help him fast enough. The sirens grew louder. Officers and paramedics arrived at the scene in what felt like an eternity, their footsteps pounding the pavement as they hurried to assess the situation. But none of it felt real. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, watching from the outside as my son was dying in front of me, helpless and scared. One of the officers knelt beside us, but I barely noticed. All I could see was Liam's face, pale and ghostly in the dimming light of the day. He looked so small, so fragile, as if this cruel world had shattered his innocence in the worst possible way. Liam, stay with me. Don't close your eyes, I urged, my voice cracking as I fought to keep the tears at bay. The paramedic rushed to Liam's side, quickly assessing the damage. We need to stabilize him. Get the pressure bandage. One of them called to their colleague who was already scrambling to open the medical bag. I watched as they worked efficiently, their hands steady even in the face of such an unimaginable situation. But I couldn't bring myself to stop looking at my son. I had to make sure he was still there, still fighting, still holding on. Liam whimpered as the pressure bandage was applied, his face contorting with every new wave of pain. The paramedics were speaking, but their words felt muffled, distant, like they were coming from another world. He's losing a lot of blood. We need to get him to the hospital now, one of them said, urgently. Get the stretcher. The stretcher was brought over, and they carefully lifted Liam onto it. I couldn't bear to let go of him. My hands were still gripping his, as if that connection was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with both pain and confusion. Mom, it hurts, he whimpered, his voice weak. I know, baby. I know. I whispered, my own voice faltering. I wanted to promise him that everything would be okay, that this nightmare would end. But I couldn't. I had no idea if everything would be okay. All I could do was hold onto the fleeting moments of connection we still had, hoping against hope that he would pull through. The police were taking statements from the neighbors, but I barely heard them. My mind was consumed by the chaos unfolding in front of me. I wanted to scream at Karen, to demand she feel the pain she had caused, to make her understand what she had done. But I couldn't. My son needed me. He needed me to stay calm, to stay strong for him. As the paramedics rushed Liam to the ambulance, I followed closely behind. My heart felt like it was being torn from my chest, but I couldn't leave him. I had to be there. I had to make sure he was okay. The sound of the ambulance's siren pierced the air, but it was a sound that only seemed to deepen the void inside me. Every second that passed felt like a precious moment slipping away from us. We arrived at the hospital in what felt like a blur. Nurses and doctors rushed into action, wheeling Liam into the emergency room. My feet moved before I even realized it, but they held me back. You'll have to wait here, a nurse told me gently, her eyes full of sympathy. But I couldn't wait. I couldn't just sit there, helpless and frozen, while my son fought for his life on the operating table. I pushed past the nurse, my legs shaking, my mind clouded with fear. I wasn't going to let them take my son away from me. Not after everything we'd been through, not after all the love and hope we'd fought so hard for. I needed to be with him. I needed to hold his hand, to tell him that everything was going to be okay. But as I stepped into the sterile white room where they were working on him, the reality of the situation hit me hard. Liam was unconscious, his face pale and covered in sweat. IVs were hooked up to his arms, and the sound of machines beeping steadily was the only thing breaking the silence. The blood, the pain, the terror was all too much. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out to touch his hand, my fingers brushing against the coldness of his skin. Please, Liam, please come back to me, I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. My voice cracked with the weight of it all. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, how much longer I could keep pretending everything was going to be fine. But I had to. For him. I couldn't let him see how scared I was. I couldn't let him see how close we were to losing everything. The sterile walls of the hospital room became a blur as time seemed to lose its meaning. Hours bled into each other, stretching into an endless cycle of waiting, praying, and hoping. The rhythmic beeping of machines was both a comfort and a constant reminder that Liam was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. His pale face, once so full of life and energy, now seemed like a shadow of the vibrant boy I had known. The weight of the situation bore down on me like a crushing force, threatening to suffocate me with every passing minute. I sat beside him, my hand gripping his as though it were the only thing anchoring me to the world. Every now and then I would speak to him, soft, comforting words meant to reassure him, to tell him that he wasn't alone. But I wasn't sure if he could hear me, if he could even understand the words I was saying. His eyes remained closed, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath, his body still and vulnerable beneath the hospital sheets. The doctors had come in and out, their faces drawn with concern, but they never gave me any definitive answers. They would say things like, "We're doing everything we can," or "He's stable for now." But their words felt empty, like a balm to soothe my panic, not a solution to the nightmare we were trapped in. They didn't tell me whether he was out of danger, whether his leg would heal, whether he would ever be the same again. They didn't tell me how many times they'd had to stop the bleeding or whether the damage to his nerves would leave him with permanent limitations. All I could do was sit there, watch him, and wait. It was in the silence of that waiting that the real struggle began. I had never felt so powerless in my life. The physical pain that I had felt when I saw Liam on the ground, bleeding and broken, had not gone away. It had simply shifted into a dull, unrelenting ache that gnawed at me from the inside. There were no words for this kind of pain. It wasn't the pain of the body, but the pain of a mother watching her child suffer, helpless to stop it. I tried to focus on his breathing. In, out, in, out. The steady rhythm was comforting, like a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. I needed him to hold on. I needed him to wake up and smile that warm, infectious smile of his, the one that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter what life threw our way. But I couldn't shake the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, things would never be the same again. What if this was the moment that changed everything? What if his laughter, the joy he had brought into our lives, would be replaced with silence? The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. I leaned back in my chair, trying to ease the weight in my chest, trying to breathe through the pain that threatened to overtake me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Another hour had passed, another hour without answers. I had to remind myself to breathe. I had to keep reminding myself that Liam was still here, still fighting, still holding on to life with everything he had. He wasn't giving up, and neither could I. But then, just as I began to feel the weight of hopelessness creeping in, something happened. His fingers twitched in mine, just the slightest movement, but it was enough to send a shockwave of relief through me. "Liam," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "Baby, are you awake? Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, slowly, groggily, as if he were waking from a deep sleep. His gaze was unfocused at first, as though the world around him was a blur. But then, gradually, his eyes found mine. There was a moment, just a brief moment, when everything stopped, the world faded away, and all that mattered was that small spark of recognition in his eyes. "Mom." His voice was barely audible, hoarse, but it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. My heart leapt in my chest as I leaned forward, holding his hand tightly. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I wiped away the tears that had begun to fall, trying to smile through the lump in my throat. "You're going to be okay. I promise." Liam's lips trembled, and he shifted slightly, his face contorting in pain as he tried to adjust his position. I could see the effort it took for him, and it broke my heart. "It hurts, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know, baby. I know. I'm so sorry. But you're so strong. You're so brave. We're going to get through this. Just take it one step at a time." But even as I said the words, I didn't know if they were true. I didn't know if he was going to be okay. I didn't know if he would ever be the same. The uncertainty weighed on me, heavy and suffocating. But in that moment, as I looked into Liam's tired, but still so familiar eyes, I realized something. We had already made it this far. We had already survived the unthinkable, and we would keep fighting. Liam's hand tightened around mine, his grip weak, but determined. I don't want to go back to that place, he said quietly, his voice trembling. I nodded, my throat tight as I fought to hold back the tears. You don't have to, baby. We're never going back there. You're here now, and that's all that matters. For the first time since the shooting, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Maybe Liam would heal. Maybe he would walk again, run again, laugh again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: we were going to fight for it. We were going to fight for him. The days that followed Liam's surgery were a blur. His condition stabilized, but it was clear that his recovery would be long and painful. The bullet had damaged more than just his leg. It had left scars that couldn't be seen. The trauma, the fear, the betrayal, all of it was etched into his soul, and no amount of medical treatment could erase that. But the physical wounds would heal eventually. The emotional ones, the ones that Karen had inflicted, would take much longer. While Liam fought his own internal battle, I found myself thrust into a different kind of war, the kind where the stakes were just as high, but the enemies were not as visible. The legal battle to bring Karen to justice was a fight I had never anticipated. The system, which should have been an ally, seemed to be working against us at every turn. There were moments when it felt like I was fighting not just for Liam, but against a tide of bureaucracy, apathy, and indifference. Karen had been arrested, but she wasn't facing the full weight of her actions. Her initial charge was aggravated assault, but her lawyers, well-paid and ruthless, managed to reduce it to something far less severe. She claimed that she had acted out of fear, that she had felt threatened by Liam's presence near her property, despite the fact that he was a child in a wheelchair, simply playing a game. The irony of it, the sheer absurdity of it, made my stomach churn. But what stung the most was Karen's indifference. She didn't show any remorse. In fact, during the court hearings, she appeared detached, as if this was just another inconvenience to her. Her eyes were cold, calculating, as if she saw no difference between what she had done to my son and a simple parking ticket violation. There was no apology, no recognition of the suffering she had caused, only a carefully crafted defense of her actions, as if she had been justified in what she did. I sat in those hearings day after day and listened to her speak, listened to her lawyers twist the narrative to make her seem like the victim. They painted her as a woman simply trying to protect her property, a victim of a child's disregard for boundaries. And the more I heard, the more I realized that Karen didn't see what she had done as a crime. She saw it as an act of control, a way to enforce her version of right and wrong with a gun, with violence. My son's life meant nothing to her. The only thing that mattered was her sense of power. The community, too, seemed divided. Some rallied behind us, offering their support, their voices raising against the injustice of what had happened. But others, those who had long feared Karen's judgment, quietly sided with her. They saw her as the self-appointed enforcer of rules, the one who kept things in line in the neighborhood. They didn't question her motives, didn't care to see the deep-seated hatred that had driven her actions. To them, Liam's disability was just another reason for Karen's behavior to be excused, another justification for her actions. The more I heard these whispers, the more the walls of isolation began to close in around me. It felt as though we were fighting not just against Karen, but against an entire system that refused to acknowledge the depth of what had happened. And then there was the media. When the story first broke, it made headlines. The images of Liam in his wheelchair, bloodied and broken, filled newspapers and TV screens. The public outcry was immediate and powerful, with many condemning Karen's actions as senseless and cruel. But as the weeks wore on, the story lost its fire. Other tragedies took the spotlight, and the public moved on, forgetting about my son and the pain he was enduring. It wasn't until the trial months later that the attention came back, but by then, the initial shock had faded. The headlines no longer had the same weight, the same urgency. In the courtroom, Karen's arrogance became even more apparent. She sat there, her arms crossed, her eyes never meeting mine or Liam's. She acted as though the proceedings were beneath her, as though she were being wrongly persecuted for something she believed was justified. It was maddening. My blood boiled as I watched her act like the victim, while my son, who had done nothing wrong, lay in a hospital bed, struggling to recover from the violence she had inflicted upon him. The disconnect between her and the reality of the situation was beyond comprehension. The prosecution, to their credit, fought hard to get Karen the maximum sentence, but it was clear they were up against a well-oiled machine. Every motion was contested, every piece of evidence scrutinized to the point of exhaustion. It became less about justice for Liam and more about legal gamesmanship. The trial dragged on, leaving us all feeling defeated, like we were chasing a shadow that kept slipping further away. But I wasn't going to give up. I couldn't. Not for Liam. Not for me. As the days turned into weeks, I watched my son's condition improve. His leg was healing slowly but surely. He had to learn to walk again, to relearn the strength that had been taken from him. But it was the emotional toll that worried me the most. Every day, there was a new fear, a new anxiety. He would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, his eyes wild with terror. He was haunted by the images of that day, by the face of Karen as she pulled the trigger. No amount of medical intervention could heal the scars in his mind, the ones that made him question his safety, his worth. But despite everything, despite the legal battles, the emotional toll, and the indifference of Karen, I refused to back down. I refused to let this woman steal my son's future. Every moment I spent with Liam, every moment I saw him smile or take another step forward, reminded me why I had to keep going. Justice wasn't just about a conviction. It was about showing my son that he was worth fighting for, that he deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, and that no one had the right to take that from him. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, as we waited for the final verdict. It had been a long and exhausting journey, filled with more setbacks than I ever imagined. But the end was finally in sight. The months of legal battles, the constant reminders of the trauma Liam had endured, the constant threat of Karen slipping through the cracks, it was all coming to a head. I was emotionally drained, but there was one last thing I needed to do. One last thing for Liam, for myself, for all the families who might find themselves in the same situation. As the judge entered the courtroom, all the eyes in the room turned toward him. Karen sat across from me, her face still impassive, as though nothing about the last few months had shaken her resolve. She hadn't changed. She wouldn't change. She was just a woman who had done what she thought was necessary, and in her eyes, the rest of the world was wrong. But for me, for Liam, the world had to be right again. The judge began to speak, his voice stern and steady. After careful consideration of the evidence, the actions of the defendant, and the long-lasting impact on the victim, this court finds the defendant guilty of aggravated assault and battery. I held my breath. This was it. This was the moment we had fought so hard for. Karen Wright, you are hereby sentenced to insert years of sentence for the crimes you committed against Liam Rivers. This sentence reflects not only the act of violence against a defenseless child, but the emotional and psychological harm that you have caused. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel a sense of relief. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest, the crushing sense of helplessness, began to lift. We had done it. Liam had done it. We had survived. But the fight didn't stop there. This victory, though significant, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something larger, something that would hopefully prevent what happened to us from happening to others. In the months after the trial, we became advocates for those whose voices were often silenced. We began to speak out about the dangers of unchecked hatred and the failure of the system to truly protect those who needed it most. I remember the first time I stood before a crowd to speak, my hands shook, my voice quivered, but I did it for Liam, for all the children who lived in fear. I talked about the need for stronger laws to protect the vulnerable, for better training for those who had the power to make decisions about other safety. And most of all, I spoke about the need for compassion, for understanding, for the humanity that seemed to be so absent in Karen's actions. The community began to change, too. While some still whispered behind closed doors, others rallied behind us. They held fundraisers, they raised awareness, and they helped Liam and I find healing. We weren't alone anymore. I wasn't alone in this fight, and neither was Liam. Slowly but surely, the wounds that Karen had inflicted began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. But Liam and I still struggled. It wasn't an easy road, and it never would be. The scars, though fading, would never fully disappear. Some days, I saw the weight of that trauma in Liam's eyes. Other days, I saw his strength, his determination to move forward, to not let the cruelty of one woman define him. His spirit was stronger than anything Karen had tried to take from him, and that was the most important thing. In time, Liam grew more comfortable outside again. We visited parks, played games, and spent hours on walks, just enjoying the world that once felt so unsafe. Each step forward was a victory. He wasn't just recovering physically, he was reclaiming his childhood, and with every laugh, every moment of joy, it was clear he was healing. We were healing. The legal victory, the justice that was finally served, gave us something we had never imagined we would have, a chance to rebuild. But it was the love, the unshakable bond between mother and son, that allowed us to truly begin again. It wasn't the law or the media or the headlines that healed us. It was the quiet moments, the simple acts of kindness, and the support of a community that had finally realized the importance of standing together in the face of injustice. Karen may have taken a piece of us that day. She may have tried to shatter everything we knew and loved, but she had failed. And with each day that Liam and I moved forward, I knew that we were stronger than she could ever comprehend. We had endured the worst, and now we were living proof that love, resilience, and hope could overcome even the most horrific of actions. And as I looked at Liam, laughing again, a joy that had once seemed impossible to reach, I realized that our story wasn't just about survival. It was about victory. It was about showing the world that no one could break us, not even the darkness that tried to swallow us whole. Liam and I had not only survived Karen's cruelty, we had emerged stronger, with a renewed purpose to ensure that no child, no family, would ever have to endure the same nightmare. The world could be a cruel place, but it could also be a place of justice, compassion, and change. And that was the future we were fighting for.